Hello, I'm Nina Pelican-Strauss. I'm here with Shemeem Abbas, Professor of Political Science, Gender Studies, and Literature at Purchase College. Shemeem?
Yes, Nina.
Shemeem has written a book, Blasphemy Laws from Islamic Empires to the Taliban, just published. And my first question for you is, at what age did you learn about blasphemy laws and heresy when you were growing up in Pakistan?
Never. It was never a subject that came up. We never talked about it. There was nothing of the kind going around in the society. And the kind of Islam that I grew up in was very tolerant. So I didn't hear about it until the Salman Rushdie case came up in 1989 when I was doing my PhD at the University of Texas at Austin. But even in my society, it was never an issue until I myself was charged with blasphemy in 1998 at the Open University in Islamabad.
So growing up as a Muslim woman, you practiced your religion without interference, without oppression, and then suddenly this changed. Is that your experience?
Yes, my experience of Islam is a very pleasant one. I mean, we had a lot of festivity around our kind of Islam that we grew up in. I was inducted into the practices of Islam in Comilla, which is now Bangladesh. At that time, it used to be East Pakistan. My father was posted there. My grandfather taught me to read the Quran, to say my prayers and everything. And I remember a very pleasant time in Ramadan in Bangladesh, where we used to celebrate the month of Ramadan, getting up in the morning, preparing for the sehri, eating, jalebis and milk, and then breaking of the fast, the iftar in the evening. And I remember there was a great preparation for it. My parents, my grandfather, and the domestic staff, we always prepared for it. And I remember the domestic staff preparing the pineapples and cutting them up and everything. So it was a very pleasant experience. And also the celebration of the month of Muharram, which is the martyrdom of Hussein, the Prophet's grandson. There was a great celebration in Comilla, and there was a procession with elephants, and everybody, Hindus and Muslims, everybody participated in it. So my experience of Islam is a very pleasant one.
And how about your Western education? How did that affect you? How did that connect with your religion as you were growing up?
I think it was very well integrated. I was educated in a convent school, in the Presentation Convent, and I grew up being educated by the nuns. These were the Presentation Convent nuns, and earlier in Comilla, I went to the convent where there were American nuns. And I mean, these were very safe institutions. Muslims all over the continent of India and Pakistan felt their daughters were very safe with the nuns.
And didn't feel there was a conflict between the two cultures, Western and Pakistani. That came later, as you say, at the time of Rushdie, yes?
Yes, Rushdie, exactly. I mean, Islam and the Western education was very well integrated. And my mother was a great supporter of Western education. And I'm still processing how come she, as a woman from inner city Lahore with such conservative values, was such a supporter of Western education for women.
Was she unusual? Do you think she was an unusual woman that way?
Yes, I think she was. She decided to leave Lahore city, and she said, women were very oppressed in the Punjab, in Lahore. And she traveled all the way to Calcutta to live with her brother, who was a very senior official in the British military at that time. He was a full colonel of the British Army, and he was posted in Calcutta where the modern ideas were, where the British were.
And your father, how was he responding to your mother's moving there to Calcutta?
Well, they hadn't married until then. They met in Calcutta.
They met there.
They met there.
So she was a young woman when this happened,
Absolutely.
when you're describing.
Absolutely. And I think because she she was an orphan, and she ended up almost being a governess in my uncle's household, educating his two girls who were going to the convents and things like that. And I think that's where she got the idea that Western education is good. And she hung out with the British crowd. She had a good education in Persian and Urdu, and she herself was a writer, and she could read Arabic.
Very international.
Very
remember.
international.
Yes.
And
like
she,
you.
Thank you. And I think she educated herself living in Calcutta, hanging out with the British crowd because of my uncle, who was very well placed in the British circles. I think she was very well groomed, and that's where she got the idea of a Western education for women.
So you had this, let's call it liberal, integrated education. Then you were forced to leave Pakistan. Can you talk about the circumstances?
Well, I mean, there's a long gap, in my various exposures to Western culture. First time I went and studied in '66 at the University of Leeds in England. This is after I lost my husband in a mission in Kashmir. And I was pregnant with my daughter, and it seemed, like the world had come to an end.
Yeah.
And my mother was very, very assertive, and despite the opposition of the family and the friends and people around her, she said, no, I'm going to keep this child that, is going to be born, and she has to go and make a life for herself in the West. And so she encouraged me to apply for a Commonwealth scholarship. I got it, and in my country, things don't happen without contacts. So
Sure.
we had good, friends, influential friends who made sure that I had the scholarship to go and study in England. And I went to Leeds to study, and I would be so unhappy. I would cry and weep, and because I missed my daughter.
Sure.
But my mother never let me come back. I mean, she kept writing letters to me saying, don't ever worry about your daughter. We're taking better care of her than you would have. Make your life, stay there. And I think it's because of her letters that I stayed on in England and completed that degree, with the result that I have a very successful life in the West, and so does my daughter.
How did your daughter come to the West finally? How did that happen?
She came with me when I came the second time round to do a PhD at the University of Texas at Austin. And so I brought my daughter with me. And the women in the international office at the University of Texas were very supportive. And I didn't have the means, I didn't have the funds, I didn't have the finances. But somehow they made sure that my daughter stays with me and she gets a Western education. And my daughter is a CPA now, a very successful CPA.
So that really worked, that transition. Tell us how you got to purchase college from Texas.
Well, when I finished my PhD and when I went back to the Open University in Islamabad, I just saw it was a different Pakistan from the one that I left in '85, when I went to the US to do my PhD. In '92, when I came back, I was shocked to see the university had been overtaken by the clerics from the madrasas who had all kind of finagled degrees that had been rubber stamped by the University Grants Commission. And, now these clerics were deans of departments and in very senior positions, and they had more or less taken over the whole university administration. So it was a very rough 7 to 8 years working with these people, and the minute I arrived, I saw the opposition. I was the chair of the department, and the way these clerics and the people that were running the university tried to humiliate me. I mean, those 7 years were really very traumatic. In between, I did have a very successful, a very supportive vice chancellor. I mean, I just found that while I was doing my PhD in America and dealing with a very serious kind of illness, the professorship in my department had been appropriated because these clerics did not want me to become a professor after my PhD. And I think the PhD was a very big threat
Yes, yes.
And some of them would ask me point blank, Dr. Sahiba, would you be the next vice chancellor of the university? I mean, they would ask me, they were afraid.
How many women were teaching at that time when you came back in 92?
There were many of them, many. They were chairs of department. They were in very senior positions. A lot of these women were in very senior positions. You see, the Open University had been established in collaboration with the British Open University. And this was a university for universal education, literacy, for adults. And the idea was a beautiful idea. And when I left in 85, it was a very secular institution. I mean, there were British consultants there. I had worked with American consultants. In fact, my coming to the University of Texas was a part of that whole secularism and the support that the university was getting from British and American agencies.
And suddenly, between 85 and the 90s, everything changed. Can you say why? I know it's a very long conversation, but can you say why or how?
I think, it is long, but people need to know what happened. What happened in between the 80s and the 90s was that slowly there had been a colonization of Islamic forces, and it all has to do with the Western powers getting into Afghanistan and to bring down the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So how could they do it? They had to build up an ideology, an Islamic ideology, and therefore, together with Pakistani's military forces, the CIA, and a lot of funding from Saudi Arabia, we got into Afghanistan. The Soviet Union was defeated. But in the meantime, what had happened was that slowly all these madrasa clerics were planted in the universities. It was a very slow process. And in fact, at that time, I did not realize in 85, because even when I left in 85, I was still chair of the Department of English at the Open University. But when the blasphemy fatwa was levied against me in 98, I realized that there had been a successful erosion of the academy in Pakistan, and these clerics had been planted there. They had been declared ulama or scholars of Islam, and the University Grants Commission was a part of it to make these clerics into the ulama of Islam.
What did they accuse you of?
Well, they accused me of having said derogatory remarks about Islam, and that I had said, that the Quran was an outdated book and it should be put away, which is not true. Nothing of the sort ever happened. But this was a fabrication. And I have a feeling that I was being followed, not only a feeling, I mean, when I was writing this book and I look at events, the way they had been happening, I was being followed successively, when I was coming back from British Council parties in the evening, because I was chair of the department representing the Pakistan government. I was being followed. And I think I was being followed because the powers that be, mainly, this whole clerical organization, they had their people following me to see if they could implicate me under Hudud laws.
Explain Hudud laws.
Hudud was again, a set of laws that were put into place by General Ziaul Haq together with the blasphemy laws. The Hudud laws were directed against women, reducing a woman's testimony to a half of a man's, and also this whole thing of zina or fornication, that if a woman was raped, she had to produce 4 male Muslim adult witnesses to prove her violation. Otherwise, she was charged with adultery or zina, which is fornication.
So these laws came into practice at a certain moment in time.
Yes, with the coming of Ziaul Haq, General Ziaul Haq, in the 70s. And he had been planted there. He had been planted there so that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's democratically elected government could be removed and the military forces could go into Afghanistan to bring down the Soviet Union. So how was a military dictator going to validate himself? He could only do it through the Islamic discourse.
Yes, yes.
And the Islamic parties in Pakistan were put on board so that, this dictatorship could be validated.
Yes.
And so how was he going to validate that dictatorship? He was going to do it with a self-created Sharia. I call it a self-created Sharia because this is not coming from the Quran. This is not coming from the Prophet Muhammad's practices. This was generated to terrify citizens. And how do you disempower 50% of the population? Just bring in these hudud laws. And Ziaul Haq had a lot of support from the Saudis on this, because that's the kind of Sharia that is practiced in Saudi Arabia. And I think this is a very tribal way of life.
So I was going to ask you tribal.
This has nothing to do with Islam. This is not Muhammad's Islam, and this has nothing to do with Islam. Muhammad was not a repressive person.
In fact, I understand that Muhammad was trying to open up the tribes to a unified religion rather than make them more tribal, and the tribalism is part of what's happened since the 70s.
Absolutely.
Yes.
You see, because this kind of Islam is very foreign to South Asia.
Mm-hmm.
South Asian Islam is a very eclectic kind of an Islam, and I think in the rest of the world, also in Africa and Indonesia, Islam would not have had so many followers had it not been for its adaptability to local cultures.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And of course, your book is quite extraordinary in combining your personal experience with what we read about in the news every single day.
Mm-hmm.
Unusual because your sense of the reformation that's possible
Mm-hmm.
in Islam comes not from someone who is skeptical about Islam, but someone who loves Islam and remembers the way that it was. So my question to you is, do you think it's going to be very difficult to transform this current situation, to in effect reform Islam in a more democratic direction?
I think I'm very positive.
You are positive.
I'm very positive. I would not give up. I would not give up, and I would not have written this book if I was not positive about it. Because I think the way things have happened with all these petrodollars, a very militant kind of an Islam is being exported not only within countries like Pakistan, but all over the world. And this is an Islam that is backed by weapons, it's backed by petrodollars, and it's a very strange kind of imperialism. Not that I deny Islam's own imperialistic history. It would not have been a world religion had it not had its own history of imperialism. But the thing is, because there's so much money and so much power involved in it, and secular people don't have the money, they don't have the power, and yet intellectuals and free thinkers are really fed up of it, but we don't have the money, we don't have the power, but we have the education, we have the thought, and we have the thinking. And since I've been here in the metropolitan area in New York and having written this book, I have connected into a community of practicing Muslims, of secular Muslims. And the way we are trying to deal with it is we're trying to write. We're trying to put it across in writing. And I'm not the only one. There's been another very powerful book written by Khalid Abul Fadl, who's a professor of Islamic law at UCLA. and he's written this book, The Great Theft.
It's called The Great
Theft, the thieving of Islam.
Theft.
Theft by militants. And the subtitle of that book is Wresting Islam from the Extremists. So we are trying to take back Islam from these extremists who are terrifying the whole world. I mean, this whole international terrorism and non-state actors are backed by a Sharia which is not Islamic Sharia. This is just an ideology. And sadly, we, the West, help support that kind of a Sharia.
How do we do that? And how do we not do that?
Well, we've done it by supporting regimes like Saudi Arabia and some of these regimes in the Gulf. I think people are afraid to talk about it openly. I'm not.
Shemeem, do you think it's about oil? Do you think it's about money in terms of American responses to all this?
Absolutely.
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 And when you teach your students, are they surprised by your point of view? Do they have stereotypes about Islam that you have to crack?
You know, interestingly not. My students are very open. They're very open in my Islam classes, and sometimes I either, give them a diagnostic paper just a one-page paper to write, asking them why they're here in my class, or I just go around the class, the beginning of the class, and ask each student to introduce themselves and ask them, why they're in this class. And all of them have said they don't trust their government, and they want to know the truth.
Do you think they're unusual in relation to the rest of Americans? Because I think Americans have a lot of, they're just about a lot of cliches about Islam. They don't know about Islam, they don't learn about Islam, and certainly when you read the New York Times, you don't get a perspective like the one you're giving us today. So do you think the students are unusual that way? Or do you think that this kind of openness will spread in America?
I think it will spread. I think I have a lot of hope from the young people in America. And on that level, I'm really happy. I'm really happy that I am here in America. Talking to audiences who are open, who are receptive.
Yeah.
And they ask me very interesting questions, especially since I'm using a part of this book in my class, the chapter on Muhammad, and in which I have pulled out a lot of information from different sources and put it all in this one chapter. This semester, the students are asking me questions that no other group has asked.
Really? What sort of questions do they ask you that you think are relevant to the issue of transforming people's stereotypes?
Well, I have a discussion of Muhammad's relationship with the Jewish tribes.
Yes.
In this chapter. And so they asked questions about that, and in fact I gave them an assignment about Muhammad's relationship with the Jewish tribes, and the responses I got was, and this was something I didn't look at myself, that Muhammad was not anti-Semitic. That was very interesting.
Very interesting.
These are students who are investigating it, they're reading through the text, they're going and doing research of their own, and they're coming back, to report that Muhammad was not anti-Semitic.
Yes, very important.
Very important.
Very important,
Very
considering what's going on in Israel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now. Yes,
So,
Palestine.
and what I like about teaching political Islam here in my classes at Purchase is that the students don't have stereotypes. They don't come with this whole baggage of of Islam.
It's good.
Which
It's good.
I like. And they give very interesting responses in their papers.
I'm reading from your book.
Please
because
do.
it's a question you ask in your book in the early pages.
Please do.
You write, can a state like Pakistan with 65 years of independence, of which 34 years have been dominated by the military, claim to deliver a secular democracy where Islam was to be used only for a moral and ethical code.
Yes, that's what Pakistan was made for. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was the founder of Pakistan, and the idea of Pakistan was a very secular man. And his many speeches, his many discourses talk about a Pakistan where all sects will be free to practice their religion. Again and again, this is what Jinnah said. I don't think Jinnah had a vision of a Pakistan being hijacked by the clerics, and the clerics who had opposed the very idea of the creation of a Pakistani state. So that was not his vision of a Pakistan or Muhammad Iqbal's vision of a Pakistan.
Are Pakistani children aware of this history?
Sadly not this generation.
Not this generation. So in other words, that history has been repressed.
Not only
That
repressed,
source and origin.
not only repressed, it's been rewritten. And sadly, it was rewritten during Ziaul Haq's time. There were complete manuals that were prepared at the University of Nebraska to educate the Mujahideen at that time. Those manuals are still being read. And then, there was a whole jihadist literature that was put forward in the curriculum. I mean, even as a professor of English at the Open University, we had a thesis, and I was interviewing one of these are master level students, about something in the curriculum, the English curriculum in Pakistan. And this woman says to me, and she's a lecturer in some college in JLM, and she says, we're not doing enough of the idea of Pakistan in the English curriculum. I said to her, is your faith or is our faith so weak that we need to have everything of the idea of Pakistan or about Islam in an English curriculum? I mean, I'm not being disrespectful to Islam.
But was that considered disrespectful?
What she might have considered disrespectful, and a lot of people would, but I still say, Islam is not so weak. Islam can coexist with other faiths, and like in my practice, I integrate a lot of other spiritual practices in my practice of Islam also, and I think that's fine. And I don't think anybody in my parents' generation would have had a problem with it.
I see. So this is a very new, a very radical kind of turn in a country's whole relation to the West, its relation to other religions, and its relation to tolerating free thinking.
Absolutely.
In every way.
Absolutely.
And how do you see the future of Pakistan now? If children are being, propagandized, what kind of generation will evolve? Do you think that television and internet and exposure to Western ideas is the answer? Will this come from inside, from outside? I've asked you so many questions. Answer any.
Nina, I don't have any idea of, how it's going to shape up. But the thing is, at the moment in Pakistan, you have two different societies. There's one which is so Western. It is so Western. And there's another, which is so radicalized. And an Indian Muslim friend of mine who went to Pakistan was just laughing. And she said, it looks like half the society has gone naked and the other have just got themselves into burqa.
Yes,
that's
how much of a gap.
How much of a gap it is.
Yeah.
So,
and this has to do with the educated and the less educated? Is it a class problem as well? In our country, there is the argument that much of the gap between the educated and the less educated in America has to do with who gets into elite colleges and who doesn't, so on. Is it a class problem as well?
I think part of it is.
Money?
Money, but then there's also a moneyed class of these women of my generation that I went to college with, very secular people. These are the big moths now, the rich, wealthy housewives. I just can't connect with them anymore because they've started going to these religious gatherings that are funded by, goodness knows, radical groups and things.
What do they get out of it? They don't. Why do they need that?
I think these are born again Muslims. These are women that are born again.
Tea Party Muslims.
Tea Party Muslims. You've said it, Nina. Tea Party Muslims. These are women who can afford it. They've got chauffeur-driven cars. They've got husbands taking care of them. So they can go to these tea parties and re-educate themselves and everything, in this new kind of an Islam that is coming up. But a woman like me, for instance, I can't afford that lifestyle. If I was living in Pakistan, I can't be dependent on a chauffeur to drive me around. I can't afford a chauffeur. I have to drive my car.
Sure.
I have to go and talk to the clerks in government offices about my home, about my property and everything. I don't have that luxury. So this is the luxury of
it's elitist Sharia?
Fascinating. 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 It's an elitist Sharia.
Amazing.
It's an elitist Sharia. I didn't even look at it from that point of view, but you've said it now, Nina.
Yeah.
It's an elitist Sharia.
How much protest is now going on? You spoke of the intellectuals, you spoke of the writers, you spoke of internationally educated persons like yourself. But how about inside the country? How much protest, how much rethinking is going on? What do you think?
You know what, Nina? I think in large part, the fact that this kind of movement has taken on so much presence has a lot to do with the Pakistani intellectuals also. I'm sorry to say. They have colluded. They don't want to rock the boat. There are too many vested interests in it.
Money?
Money, power, connections, or they just don't want to deal with
And nationalism. Always a powerful source, no?
Not so much
Pakistani
nationalism.
for Pakistan?
Not so much nationalism. Some of them, yes, but I would say expediency. They don't want to even talk about it. They're afraid of being slaughtered. They're afraid of being killed because the governor of the Punjab province, Salman Taseer, got assassinated by his own bodyguard trying to repeal these blasphemy laws. The Minister for Minority Affairs got assassinated, shot in fact, a month after that. I think people are afraid of their lives. So nobody wants to
deal with it. You have a whole page in this book of people who have been assassinated.
Absolutely.
For supposedly violating certain laws.
I wouldn't even use the word violated, but for trying to do something about them. I mean, Sherry Rahman, who was from the PPP, from the People's Party, they are a more secular party. I mean, although they're very corrupt. And the other thing also is, Benazir Bhutto's assassination.
Yes.
He was the only hope. He was the only secular hope for Pakistan. They shot her.
So assassination works as a form of psychological terrorism.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's intimidation.
Yes.
If you don't listen to us, this is what we will do. My friends in Pakistan, a lot of them, my lifelong friends have stopped talking to me because of this book now. Also, they're afraid. People have asked me, and some of my colleagues here at Purchase have also asked me that, aren't you afraid for yourself?
Yes, how do you answer when they ask you about your own fears, or you don't have fears? You're a brave woman.
No, I don't have any fears. What can they do? They can shoot me. Okay, they can do it. I've written the book. The book will stay.
It's true. And it's a great book, Shemeem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Fun to talk.